We're going to be talking to Wasim. We're going to be talking to Wasim Ahmed, who's a analyst for the Canadian Institute for Climate Choices, about a blog post that he recently wrote. Is your province ready for a low carbon future? Now, this is really interesting to me because I'm working on a big research project, a deep dive about Clean BC, which is the BC climate policies, and the need to electrify the BC economy in order to get to meet the Clean BC climate targets. And it's really hard. BC, most British Columbians don't understand just how much change has to be implemented in order to hit those targets. And so I began to think, well, what about other provinces? So welcome to the interview, Wasim.
Glad to be here.
Well, why don't we start out with, if you could give us an overview of your blog post, please.
Absolutely. So the blog post follows on the heels of our first major report on the clean growth theme at the Institute, whereby we look at some indicators to gauge how well Canada is decoupling the economy and to meet our long-term clean energy goals. So this blog post is an overview of that. So we look at various topics such as decoupling the economy from greenhouse gas emissions, gauging our productivity, both in terms of employment and gross domestic product. And lastly, we ended with some conclusions that governments across Canada can implement to help reach these goals.
Right, and it was interesting to note that the long-term trend, well, maybe not the long-term trend, but the trend of late is that the amount of emissions per unit of GDP is actually falling. Have I got that correct?
That's correct. Canada-wide, it's falling, but every province has a different performance. It's actually been on the uptick as of the past few years.
Yeah, that's interesting because, of course, we see BC's been going up a little bit, I think, because it's got some oil and gas, and of course, Alberta from my point of view, Alberta is the speed bump for Canadian climate policies, because of course, with the expansion of oil and gas, and we've seen, I think, over the last 10 years, about another 1 million barrels a day of oil sands production, very greenhouse gas intensive. What in the world, what do you say about Alberta and the difficulties it's going to have in getting its emissions down?
So one of the purposes of the blog was not to provide a ranking for every province, but rather to look sort of independently at what each province can do. Now you have Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Newfoundland, who may not have the largest decoupling score, that is the score given to them by our calculations. So what we did is we took the growth in GDP from 2005 until 2018, and then the growth in greenhouse gas emissions during the same period. And that final difference is their decoupling score. So as I mentioned, Newfoundland, Alberta, and Saskatchewan may not perform the best on decoupling score. And a large part of that is due to the way their economic structure is set up. So what they can do in the future is they can work on transitioning from oil, gas, and other very pollutive industries to a more clean energy industry. So there's huge potential for hydrogen, for example, geothermal energy. This will help them increase their GDP, creating jobs, while also bringing down emissions over time.
But you can imagine how controversial that will be in Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Newfoundland, because oil and gas, they don't want to abandon that. That has a lot of economic impacts, lots of employment, especially in Alberta. I mean, the whole, it's a very, very big chunk of their economy. But you mentioned there's some suggestions at the end, and one of them was, or two of them that caught my eye, technology innovation and technology adoption. And I see the federal government and to a lesser extent the provincial government putting more and more money into innovation, into new technologies. I assume that you would agree that that's the right way to go for the government.
That is one way to go, yes. So as you mentioned, there's two potential avenues that we can take. One of them is technology development. So that is developing new technologies that will help us reach our long-term goals, for example, to become net neutral by 2050. And the other is to adopt these technologies ourselves. So we're looking at technologies such as carbon capture and sequestration, advancing geothermal energy, building up our hydrogen production capacity, which actually uses the oil wells found in Alberta, Saskatchewan. But then we want to go beyond that and take these technologies and actually start adopting them, right? So this can be in the form of electrification of our grid. So we saw that in Ontario and Quebec, for example. And that's a large part how we were able to see reductions in greenhouse gas emissions and even increasing our decoupling score in those provinces. And also to electrify our automobiles and vehicle fleets. So things like buses, trains, airplanes, which are now our largest source of emissions in a lot of provinces.
Yeah, I think the electrification strategy, I mean, that is at the core of the Canadian climate policies. It certainly is at the core of Clean BC. What about Ontario? Is it planning a large-scale electrification of transportation, buildings, industry as a way to bring its GHG emissions down?
There are some initiatives going on right now. So if you remember a few years ago, our entire electrical grid was electrified. So we have completely weaned off of coal and are now 100% clean energy. There have been investments by private firms, so Ford, GM, to build electric vehicles in Ontario and the GTA. And even living here in Toronto, I see on the streets some electric buses as part of a test pilot. So the Toronto Transit Commission, the TTC, is starting to use electric buses as part of its fleet in this push for a more electrified transit system.
So it sounds like the provinces are in various stages of being prepared for a low carbon future. We could argue Ontario is making progress. Quebec, of course, is very aggressive on this front. BC, and then some of the other provinces have a little bit of a deficit, dug themselves in a hole because they have emissions intense industries. So it can be a little tougher for them. Is that a fair summary of where we're at?
More or less. So the provinces that, to use your words, have dug themselves in a hole, I wouldn't classify it as that per se. So for example, in our decoupling score, Newfoundland had the lowest one, just 2, which means that the difference between greenhouse gas emission growth and GDP growth was only 2%. But that said, they are working on a new hydroelectric dam project in Muskrat Falls. So once that is up and running, we will see their decoupling score increase and their economy will be more green than it is today.
Right. Okay. Well, thank you very much, Wasim. I really appreciate this. And we'll be, I'm sure, talking to you in the near future because this is going to be the idea that we have to decouple our economy from greenhouse gas emissions, bringing emissions down even while GDP rises. That's not going away. That's going to be a trend for, it's a long-term trend. So thank you very much for these insights.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thanks, sir.
Thank you.